Great. Good afternoon. Thank you all for joining the New England or Boston ICPA Data Group. We're excited to have you all on for our webinar today on trade export controls and sanctions development. In general, ICPA, we're aiming to network. So as we get started, we'll have our two presentations. But at the end, we do hope that it's interactive. So feel free to, take cameras off, take your microphone off, and we can chat and communicate that way after the presentations from our speakers. So the goal of this group is to serve the needs of the trade compliance community. So we bring together practitioners, thought leaders, and policymakers to share practical and timely insights that help us all stay on top of our ever-changing regulatory and policy and trade landscape. So today's session is no exception to this. Over the past month, we've seen significant regulatory shifts, and we'll walk through those updates together towards the end of the session. But we'll start by hearing from two outstanding speakers, both of whom bring legal and operational perspectives on how to navigate trade today. So Sean Carlissimo will walk through the Department of State's role in sanctions, and Ruta Riley will discuss tariff mitigation strategies. As I said, we do hope this to be an interactive session. So at the end, throughout, I should say, feel free to use the chat function, introduce yourself there, share where you're calling in from, ask questions there, and then we will get to those questions at the end. Last time we did have some technical difficulties. If we do get disconnected, I will send out a link and attempt to reconnect everyone. So feel free to rejoin if there are any issues. And also, before we get started, a quick reminder, everything shared in today's session is for general informational purposes and should not be taken as legal advice. So if you do have specific questions about your company's situation, be sure to consult your counsel or reach out to Sean or Ruta to establish a relationship with them, but do not take today's presentation as strict legal advice, please. And this session is eligible for broker credits. I will post those in the chat towards the end of the session. And as always, you can email me if you have any issues with that link. I will drop my email in the chat as well for anyone who doesn't have it already. With that, all that housekeeping out of the way, let's get started. I am very pleased to introduce Sean Carlissimo. He is a counsel in the International Trade and Investment Group at Miles Stockbridge. Sean advises clients on export controls, sanctions, cross-border regulatory risk, and draws from his prior experience at the U.S. Department of State's Office of the Legal Advisor, where he worked on economic sanctions, trade law, and arms control matters. Sean will start us off with a look at the Department of State's role in sanctions. So with that, Sean, I will hand it over to you.
All right, thank you so much. Let me make sure I've got this presenting. Is that okay? Is that working?
Yep, looks good.
All right, perfect. Well, thank you so much. That was a fantastic introduction. So as Ann mentioned, I am counsel at Miles and Stockbridge in our international trade and investment practice. I previously spent 6 years at the State Department working on a variety of legal issues, including economic sanctions. And so what I wanted to do today is talk to you about the State Department's role in administering sanctions programs. I think it's a less well understood function. Of course, OFAC is typically the face of sanctions programs, but the State Department plays a really important role kind of throughout the life cycle of sanctions. And I will try to illustrate through the lens of Syria, just given the high-profile developments that we've seen over the last few months, the general termination of the Syria sanctions program, but also some sanctions that do remain. So to just walk through our brief agenda, I'll talk about the State Department's role at the inception of a sanctions program, establishing one, its role in designations and targeting, its role in licensing, specific and general licensing, and then also its role in just engaging with the international community on its sanctions programs. So first, establishing a sanctions program. Of course, the State Department is the lead agency responsible for conducting the foreign policy of the United States. So it plays a really critical role in creating sanctions programs. So it's going to lead in diagnosing foreign policy issues that an administration wants to address, strategizing on how to address them, thinking through the different carrots and sticks that might be available, all of the different tools. One of those key tools might be the creation of a sanctions program. And so when the executive branch is creating the program, it's typically going to be through an executive order. And the State Department is going to play a really important role in, and this is something that I worked on when I was at State, in shaping those orders. So defining the scope of the order, figuring out which prongs and which type of conduct should be subject to sanctions, coordinating on which agency should receive that designation, the designation authorities, whether it's the State Department that's going to receive the authorities, or if it's OFAC that's going to receive those authorities. So one example we have in the Syria context, which is still on the books today and is kind of a key authority for what has recently been renamed the Promoting Accountability for Assad and Regional Stabilization Sanctions, which really roll off the tongue. But back in 2019, you had the Turkish intervention into Syria, and the U.S. government's response was to issue Executive Order 13894, which created sanctions to address that issue. It's been amended a number of times and is still part of existing sanctions, but State would have played a key role in assessing that issue, figuring out how to use the sanctions, and even actually had designation authority, which it still has today, under that specific executive order. When Congress is creating a sanctions program, the State Department does continue to play an important role, but it's going to be more in terms of communicating the administration's concerns or its interests in the statutory sanctions that are under consideration. And so the conversation with Congress might be about whether the sanctions are going to be compulsory or are they going to be discretionary? Is there going to be a waiver authority that's included within the statutory text that can be used to overcome some of the sanctions requirements? So this is something that we saw the waiver authority play out in the Caesar Act back in May, where the State Department exercised that waiver authority to overcome some of the sanctions requirements related to Syria. We've seen it play out in Iran, Syria. I'm sure it's playing out in the Russia Sanctions Act that's currently under discussion as well. So state really plays an important role at the inception of a sanctions program, whether it's the executive branch creating it or the legislative branch that's creating it. In terms of designations, state often receives joint designation authority with OFAC. At times, it also has exclusive designation authority. And so you'll see State Department designations, even though OFAC is the one maintaining the lists, State Department is going to, does actually do some of the designations. So you see this in the Iran context for counterterrorism sanctions under Executive Order 13224, in the Russia context, in the executive order that I just mentioned, 13894. In the Syria context, you see HTS, which is the group that is largely responsible for toppling Assad and continues to play an important role in administering Syria following Assad's fall. HTS was designated by the State Department as both a specially designated global terrorist and as a foreign terrorist organization. So state regularly exercises designation authorities. And when it does that, it is pulling together information, it is strategizing on targets. Should we go after this person? Should we go after this person? What are the drawbacks? Thinking through sequencing of designations if it's a program that's ramping up, and also leading on interagency discussions as different targets are considered. And the department will also draft the packages based on the specific prongs that are within its authority. When OFAC is exercising the designation authority, the State Department's still going to play an important role. In this case, it's going to be more behind the scenes, but it's still going to review the potential targets and the designation packages, and it's going to provide foreign policy guidance based on its deep understanding of the geopolitical context, based on its relationship with host country governments, State is going to be the one that has to really navigate any bilateral irritants that are created by certain designations that a host country government might not like. They're also going to be out front, and we'll talk about this later, but they'll be out front in coordinating with our bilateral partners as well. So they're still going to play an important role when OFAC is the one exercising the designation authority. And then when a party petitions for delisting, or certain times there are statutory requirements for delisting, state still is going to provide important perspective. Again, it's going to provide that foreign policy guidance. In certain circumstances, including with the FTO list, state is actually the one with the authority to remove entities from those lists. And so you see state with a significant role in the designations process, in the de-designations process. In terms of licensing, this is a bit more behind the scenes until we get to the waiver authorities, which I'll discuss in a moment. But for specific licenses, again, state is going to review the licenses. They're going to provide foreign policy guidance, and they're going to present various State Department equities that might not be captured in OFAC's consideration of a license. And so they're going to reflect their interests in the bilateral relationships that might be implicated by a license, or the various different kinds of policy interests that are reflected across the State Department, whether they're regional, human rights, counterterrorism, et cetera. And these various equities in the policies underlying our sanctions programs, and whether a license should or should not be issued. For general licenses, state will carefully consider whether general licenses should be issued and how they impact the policy goals of a sanctions program. And there sometimes can be interagency disputes over whether a general license should be issued or should not be issued. And sometimes there are just really complex factual underlying factual scenarios that require the State Department, which might have deeper expertise on a particular issue set, to actually craft the general license or to revise it in a way that reflects the factual circumstances that the program is either trying to capture or trying to exclude. With respect to waiver authorities, state is actually the one that typically is delegated that waiver authority. They're usually written into statutes, usually have either a national security or foreign policy basis for exercising of that waiver authority. And so, as I mentioned before, in the Syria context, the waiver back in May of the Caesar Act, certain Caesar Act requirements, is one example of this, where the Caesar Act requires the imposition of sanctions for certain Syria-related transactions. State Department waived those requirements, all as part of this relaxation of sanctions on Syria. And then in terms of international engagement, actually, just back to this one other example for general licenses, General License 25, which was another one of these measures to relax sanctions on Syria. You actually saw in Executive Order 14312, which is the executive order that generally terminated the Syria sanctions program. You see an express acknowledgement of the role that the State Department played in crafting General License 25 as part of these steps to relax sanctions on Syria. And then finally, at international engagement, state, again, is going to be in the lead on navigating both bilateral relationships and then the multilateral elements of sanctions programs. So the bilateral level, state is going to do a lot of the coordinating on programs like Russia, where you have the crude oil price cap, some of the discussions that are going on now, Syria with the lifting of sanctions, where there are a number of like-minded countries that have been interested in taking the same approach as the U.S. So state is going to be in the lead on a lot of those conversations. And also navigating these bilateral irritants that I mentioned earlier, where a host country government might not be thrilled about a particular designation or about a particular sanctions program. And so state is going to be talking to that host country government. They might notify them of a designation. They might be responding to requests and comments from that government. And so they play a really important role, and they're particularly receptive to concerns of partner countries. At the UN, again, state is going to be engaging the UN on sanctions programs. They're going to be engaging at the UN Security Council, which is responsible for the UN sanctions programs. So while there isn't a Syria-specific sanctions program, HTS is still designated under the counterterrorism program under Security Council Resolution 1267. And the executive order that I mentioned earlier, 14312, you see instructions from the president to the State Department to engage in the UN on different ways to further relax sanctions that are impacting Syria. So with that, I will stop talking. I'm happy to discuss any element of this. And thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, Sean. That was a lot to cover. Very interesting, though. So yeah, hopefully we'll get some discussion going towards the end. And I'm not seeing any questions come in yet, but if anyone does have a question, please feel free to raise that when we get to the end. And with that, next we'll hear from Ruta Riley, who's the founder and managing partner of Onelex Partners. Ruta brings many years of experience in global trade, spanning from in-house to law firm roles. Currently, she's helping companies build strategic, risk-aware trade programs that balance cost, efficiency, and regulatory expectations. So today, we get to hear from her on her perspective on how companies can translate new regulations into practical compliance strategies and mitigate some of these tariffs that we see coming in, and do that in a way that you won't get in trouble for. So with that, Ruta, I will go ahead and share my screen and hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, Anne. I think it was the nicest introduction I ever received. I'll copy paste it into my LinkedIn profile or something. So, and nice to meet everyone, and thank you for having me here. I couldn't figure out how to share my slides, so Anne is stepping in. We can proceed, please. So, I have a few slides here, and obviously we're talking about tariff mitigation strategies. And so these two slides are really an overview of mechanisms that are available for importers. I heard that there is a lot of expertise in the room, and a lot of participants who are very, very experienced. And I generally feel that the level of sophistication and trade compliance has increased exponentially. So for some of you, it may be just a reminder. But so with the overview, I really want to focus a little bit more detail on the first sale rule, and also on TIB, temporary importation, and the bond, but that's later. So, across these two slides, it's really all of the mechanisms that are available to you to try and reduce tariffs, right? Pros and cons to each one, depending on the level of risk. If you're a startup, you may tolerate a certain amount of risk, and if you are, a federal contractor manufacturing warplane planes, you have a different kind of risk and maybe have a different level resource available. But so tariff engineering or reclassification would be one of the tools that you can do that does not require significant resources, unless your database is like several thousand items long. However, you can look at certain items and reclassify them one by one. The big call out is to make sure that what your reclassification, if you are reclassifying an item, make sure that it does not impact your previous filed, maybe you sought a 301 exception, or maybe a 232 exception, and make sure that it doesn't jeopardize your previous decision, because maybe you reclassify an item and you are now subject to a lower duty rate, but you could get called out for having claimed a certain exception, a tariff exemption previously under the old code, right? So you could be looking at 5-year statute of limitations and past duties and penalties and things like that. So make sure like view reclassification holistically, right? Supply chain restructuring, of course, it's easy to say, very hard to do. Because you're looking, I think, to change out a vendor in a complicated supply chain, you're looking probably like a 2-year contract negotiation, vendor vetting, and things like that. So, like I said, easier said, but I know some companies have completely shifted their manufacturing. to maybe Mexico and things like that to be able to qualify maybe for free trade agreements. So it is available. With one thing to be said is that I think with the volatility of the tariffs, right? Until they settle down, it's certain locations may be easier, sort of like more secure than others. So Mexico will be subject to USMCA free trade agreement treatment, but other countries, if you shifted from Vietnam to I don't know, Taiwan or something, or to India, and all of a sudden you're looking at 50% reciprocal tariff on India. So it's a decision not to be taken lightly. I
Sorry,
can just
my computer
no, it's okay.
stopped
It's
sharing.
It doesn't really matter. So we can talk about so bonded warehouses, of course, and free trade zones on the following side, sort of. You defer a tariff. That's the biggest advantage. You defer a tariff when you're talking about free trade for foreign trade zones. You're looking maybe at tariff inversion, meaning you can import components into the free trade zone and manufacture an item of it, and you're going to be subject only. You can select on which item, either at component level or the finished item level, to pay duty on, right? So that could be very useful. Bonded warehouses are used primarily for storage. So it's really good for, I think, anytime for like just-in-time inventory management, or if you need to have stock, maybe to have stock for order fulfillment, but you want to have it close by and things like that. That's a good measure. Free trade agreements, as always. But one call out is probably free trade agreements, and a lot of these tariff saving measures require a heavy administrative burden. So how are you going to administer this free trade agreement? Do you have the qualification processes in place and things like that? And that is not to dissuade anyone from using it, but make sure you understand like what is involved. We can proceed, and if you could. So anytime you're talking, for example, as simple as duty drawback, as simple as if you're talking about like a carnet, right? It's a lot of admin work. Do you have that, and do you want to really, if you are saving, if you're spending 30 hours on administering a single carnet, is it worth it for you to save $300? So always consider the admin duty involved, right? Duty drawback, of course, if you import and export the item, and there are various duty drawback provisions that you can use. It can be sort of like a fungible merchandise. It can be similar goods and things like that. But the idea is that you get 99% of duties and taxes back, duties and fees back. There are certainly competent providers out there who actually, that's all they do. They do drawback claims, so you can make that available for yourself. We talked about free trade zones. Section 232 is a little bit dicey. We don't know, it's very lively, let's speak, but it's all sort of like temporary, because the exceptions are, the exclusions are expiring quickly. It's very competitive. It's the U.S. companies can file for requests to exclude on a daily basis, and that is very, very active. So I think it's tough to do. And then first sale and TIB. These are my next two slides, so we can talk a little bit more about it. If we could proceed to the next slide now. So first sale rule is really a valuation principle, right? But it's also a tariff mitigation strategy, and we see a lot of requests to assess whether a sale or importation transaction qualifies for it. So I just want to talk a little bit about it. Okay. So the regulatory background for first sale rule says that you can declare the value of the merchandise upon importation based on the price actually paid or payable when sold for exportation to the United States, right? So price actually paid or payable for exportation. So as sort of like the name implies, it has to be a multi-layer transaction. So it has to be a contract. Let's say a contract manufacturer in Vietnam is selling to the middleman in France, and then a company imports it into the U.S. importer. So a minimum of 2 sales, right? And the requirements, the basis is that you have to have multiple sales. It has to be a good faith sale, right? So bona fide sale. So I think actually to step back I think this is just to say it outright, is that first sale is subject to very, very high scrutiny from customs. Customs doesn't particularly like this valuation, obviously, because you're trying to declare a lower value. And you will be subject to a lot of sort of like poking and prodding and trying to determine if can you really evaluate, can you really declare a lower value. You can save substantial money. You can save 20+% on the declared value, right? But you have to sort of like prove to customs that you can do this, and you can even request a customs ruling to say, this is our proposed transaction, can we use first sale, right? And that's the sort of the safest way to do it. So going back to the requirements, so if you have a bona fide sale, customs will look at everything. So, does the middleman, for example, pay for the goods? If they are not paying for the goods, if they're not paying for the goods, the customs will ask you, is there really is there like a middleman even involved, right? Does the middleman take possession of the goods? Do they assume the risk of loss, or what are the delivery terms? And everything has to be based with the really 0 to 100. So from the start to the importation, everything has to be based on documentation, on purchase orders, contracts, agreements, things like that, right? Invoices, payment terms. The transaction has to be at arm's length, and this is similar to transfer pricing studies. So customers will look at circumstances of sale, right? Is it really sort of like, is the transaction happening as if it would happen between unrelated parties, right? And if you have unrelated parties, it's easier to say that the transaction is at arm's sale. But I think a couple of years there was a case where an importer got penalized over $1 million for, it was unrelated buyer and seller, but the importer into the United States sort of like they changed the delivery terms to, I think, from DDP, from delivered duty paid, to free on board, right? And then work backwards to sort of arrive at like what they wanted to declare and what the manufacturer should charge the middleman, right? So just because you're like unrelated, it still has to be sort of up and up. It has to be an arm's length transaction, and there you are looking at whether the transaction value declared to customs is close to the test value. So is it similar to what you would expect to see from a regular non-first sale valuation import, right? And clearly destined to export for the U.S., right? So maybe the goods have specific labeling. Maybe there's labeled maybe the country of origin marking is labeled pursuant to U.S. substantial transformation rules and things like that, right? So does it maybe have specific labeling? Of course, if you have direct shipment from, let's say, Vietnam, bypassing France and going into the United States, it's of course clearly destined. The funny thing is that, like, yes, clearly destined, you have a direct shipment, but then you say, well, hold on, but the middleman didn't take the possession of the goods or didn't assume the risk of loss, which is a factor against you, right? So this is a really, I think we see importers now really start to pay attention. This is an intensive exercise, worthwhile, but then be sort of like ready for an intensive assessment exercise and document. I think, and I think from the challenges, but all I want to say here is that it's a very high rejection rate by customs, probably 30 to 50%. So it's a little bit tough to do. Next slide, please. And this is, I think, this is a little bit more of an esoteric point. I don't know how much people you can use it, but you have a set of harmonized tariff schedule under heading 9813, and you have certain tariff numbers which allow you to import goods and import the goods under a TAB. Right. This is a nice tool if you want to import goods, for example, for testing or research and development. If you want to import, if let's say a pharma company wants to import maybe testing equipment, and maybe test samples and medication or whatever is under development, and you do not have to pay duty on it. I'm bringing up pharma because pharmaceutical equipment, any kind of equipment can be, you can have a single equipment that's worth $5 million. So it's a worthwhile exercise, right? It's an up to years. You can use it up to a year, and then you extend it with up to 3 years with customs approval, right? The goods must be either destroyed in the process or re-exported. So you cannot enter them into the U.S. commerce, for consumption. And when I say destroyed, is, for example, you import something and maybe you use it up in the process of testing, or you use it up in the research and development, and that's the idea of it. And I don't know if I had one more slide. I forget. I think this is just a little bit of how you can use it and for what you can use it. And one final thing is that of course you can use the transportation TAB for transshipment. So if you need to ship the goods from Canada to Mexico or something like that, it's you enter a TAB and you don't have to clear customs or pay duty and things like that. So that's all I had.
Great. Thank you, Ruta. Very helpful. Thank you, both of you. Let me just get out now of all of my sharing. Sorry that my sharing screen kept disconnecting. Not sure what's going on there. So thank you both very much. We'll get into discussion in just a minute. I do want to just highlight a few key things that have come up. I'm sure everyone on this call is already aware, and I'm sure they will lead to lots of discussion, but just in few updates. So one being the Section 232 tariffs on certain timber and engineered wood products, just flagging that was effective as of yesterday. So CSMS guidance did go out on that. If anyone needs specific information on the HS codes covered or what that looks like, feel free to reach out to me, or I'm sure anyone else who you get tariff advice from can update you on those. Also, BIS, a few things. So first, 29 new entities added to the entity list last week. We saw the addition of some addresses again, so building on, there aren't entity names on those, just addresses. So as always, paying attention to addresses, facility names in your screening processes, not just entity identifiers. Then, of course, the affiliates rule. So for anyone who hasn't dug into this too far, I know there's a lot of discussion around this right now, but foreign entities owned 50% either directly or indirectly, individually or by aggregate, by entity list, MEU, or SDNs, are automatically subject to the parents restrictions. So keeping that in mind, that the CSL is no longer exhaustive, you should be conducting additional ownership research beyond name matching. Red flag 29. So if you do have knowledge of listed owners, this is creating an affirmative duty to determine the ownership percentage, making sure that it's not going above that 50%. So make sure that you're checking corporate registries, whether those be open source, commercial databases, requesting customer certifications of ownership structures, considering direct and indirect ownership, and aggregating ownership across all of the different lists. So across entities, MEUs, SDNs. I think I already covered that. 232s. Also, as much as we're talking about BIS and tariffs, forced labor is not out of the realm of what we should be paying attention to. So CBP did issue a new withhold release order targeting bicycle parts, and accessories made by Giant Manufacturing in Taiwan. So again, just don't forget about this forced labor in your supply chains. There's a lot going on, but that still is a focus for CBP. So under the WRO, any shipments from Giant or goods suspected of being produced by them can be detained at U.S. ports until the importer provides proof of clean labor practices. And then finally, OFAC has also issued several new sanctions. At least in the past month, there are Cambodia-related cybercrime network sanctions, Iran-related energy and regional destabilization sanctions, Taiwan, Singapore, additional designations there. So make sure that you are keeping up on your continuous screening as you stay up to date on all of these regulations. As I said, there is a lot going on. So if there is something that has happened recently that I didn't cover or that someone wants to dig into anymore, please feel free to jump in and highlight that for the group. The goal here, as I said at the beginning, is information sharing. I'll open it up now for discussion. So if we have any questions for Sean or Ruta, or if I missed anything that anyone feels should be brought up, or if in general people are just looking for advice, I will open it up now for questions and post also the broker credits in the chat and also stop the recording. So let me stop the recording before we get started on the questions.